Hello, insatiable listeners. Allie here. We are going to be turning the tables here in between season 4 and 5 for 3 weeks. We will return with new insatiable episodes on Wednesday, August 29th with season 5. And we're kicking it old school as it's back to school season. You'll find out what I mean by that then. In the meantime, I am going to be sharing with you some of my favorite interviews that I've recently done on other podcasts. You'll get quite a range of topics these 3 weeks, but that's how I roll, wide and deep. All of them will support you in your own epic health story. So enjoy. Also, if you haven't left an iTunes review, please consider doing it if the show has helped you. We are so close for my 100 review goal. This helps more people find the show. The more people find the show, the more we start changing the conversation away from dogma and into discovery. So thank you all who have. We've had some really wonderful reviews this lately. I'll read one that I really appreciated. Design Lover 757997 wrote, nuanced, smart, and sassy too. I'm exhausted of the constant unhealthy messages that barrage us everywhere from Instagram feeds. Seriously, those people with super round butts, they don't tell you it's implants, to our diet culture in general. Insatiable, my personal weapon of resistance against those messages. It's balanced, intelligent, and Allie, the host of the podcast, brings in some of the most interesting people I've heard in podcast interviews. Look, if you want to break free from rigid rules but still live a healthy and balanced life, Insatiable can help you carve out your own path. No rules, no dogma, just thoughtful new ways of seeing and being in the world. Thank you, Design Lover 757997. I'll be reading some more in our upcoming season. Also, one final health thing to keep in mind. My fall program, Why Am I Eating This Now, starts September 25th. If you are tired of being in the on-off eating cycle, if you're tired of fighting your body and yourself, and you think it's finally time to surrender and look into what this is all about, this is why I created this program for you. All the details are at allieshapiro.com/why am I eating this now. Sign up to my list and you'll get a bunch of great content that won't be shared here, but it will be shared for my list, so you can get a sense if the program is right for you. Also, I created this program so that people could really understand how different my approach is. And so if you were interested in the Truth with Food program that starts in January of 2019, if you take Why Am I Eating This Now, I created it so you can get the most value when you start Truth with Food. And we will credit the price of what you paid for Why Am I Eating This Now towards your Truth with Food tuition. So there's really no risk. And I created it so people can get a sense that you cannot fail this process. What I realized all these years is people don't not trust me. They don't trust themselves not to fail, not to crash and burn. And I created Why Am I Eating This Now? So it's a low risk, not an all or nothing extreme way for you to see and start to start the self-discovery process so that you can be the person who doesn't need to battle food, and we can strengthen you versus building up the battle with more food rules. So check that out. And I'll just leave you with this quote to inspire you, because guys and ladies, life is really short. I do not want you to waste any more time battling food, especially when there's so much liberation and inspiration on the other side of your food battle, if you take it as an invitation into self-discovery. But my client, Sarah S., who just completed Truth with Food and gave me permission to use her sentiment, told me that Truth with Food saved her life. That is no small feat, okay? And she started with Why Am I Eating This Now in the fall. So if you want to get on with your life in a new and liberating way, I hope you'll join us this fall. In the meantime, before we get back to new Insatiable episodes on Wednesday, August 29th, enjoy these 3 episodes where I was interviewed.
Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of Lotus Way, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. Welcome to this week's episode of the Flower Lounge. This is going to be a good one, guys. I'm so excited to have Ali Shapiro. She's the founder of Truths with Food, and she's the host of the top-ranked podcast called Insatiable. She's a holistic nutritionist, an integrated health coach, and a rebel with a serious cause. She is academically, practically, and empathetically aware of how the medical system, diet culture, and body positivity movements all have their own flavor of crazy. She created her Truths with Food method while in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, where she got her master's in organizational dynamics, which is like getting an MBA in the change process, where she drew from her decade plus of working with real life clients and her own personal healing journey from having cancer as a teenager. I'm super stoked to have this conversation. Thanks for being here, Ali.
I'm so honored, Katie. I respect your work so much, and it's helped my clients so much. So this is such a joy.
Yay. Okay, so let's do our usual flower exercise. If you want to close your eyes and go back to a lovely little time in your childhood when you used to play around flowers or plants or trees, and see if you can identify a favorite and just think about what you were doing at that time in your life. And if you could describe the personality of your favorite flower or botanical in 3 words, just note which 3 words those would be. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes and just share a little bit about what you thought.
Yeah, I think my first memory of how much I love nature was there was me and a couple of our neighborhood kids. We would go on these like nature hikes, and looking back now, it seemed like we were there forever, but maybe it was a mile. But we were away from parents and we would go in our backyard, and it was very wild. Like it wasn't a park, or there was in fact, there was like a highway if we went down too far one way, but we would just like go, and then we would come out at the other end of our plan.
Yeah.
But it was totally in nature, and it seemed like we were doing this like big adventurous Goonies type exploration. We were probably not that far into the woods. But being with everybody and like trying to find our way, and then there was a little thrill there, right? Like, are we going to make it? And then you come out and you're like, oh, I see houses again. But I think that's one of my earliest, fondest memories of nature, and the trees especially. I really love trees.
And so what would you, like from that experience, what would one of your favorites be? Would it be a tree or something else you saw along the way?
I think it has to be the trees. I love, as I've gotten older and learned about how trees communicate with each other, and they have this intelligence that it's there, but we can't see it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something really mysterious about them, but grounding. I love that tension of opposites of you can feel really grounded around some trees, but there's a safety there's a grounding, but there's also this mystery, right? Like when I go in the parks now and I see some of the trees that are being uprooted, I'm like, how many hundreds of years have they been here? What have they seen? What have they heard?
Yeah. So when you say mysterious, what does that mean? Like ancient wisdom?
Yeah. Ancient wisdom, for sure. I love that term. Yeah.
Okay, because what we find is the words you use to describe the childhood botanical is how you bring your gifts into the world. So mysteriously, right? With ancient wisdom and a grounded way and a very safe way, you make a safe space for people. And there's some sort of tension of opposites.
Yeah, I love that, because I think paradox is where truth is, right? And I tell my clients what we resist persists, and what we embrace dissolves. And you kind of have to sink below those tension of opposites to be like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Totally. Yeah, let's talk some more about tension of opposites.
Ooh,
where do you see that in your work? And do you want to tell us a little bit about like what's got you going these days?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'll start with the tension of opposites, in that I think in our culture, we have traditionally, I think the ancient wisdom, right, was about kind of going through the pain and being with it and dancing with it, not always, not always being joyful, but you had to have a way to discharge it, right?
Right.
And I think what's happened is we've swung so far the other way of unattachment and detachment and even mindfulness. Sometimes when I was really struggling with my own food battle, which is part of what got me into this, I went to this mindfulness-based stress reduction course recommended by my integrative physician, who I love deeply. And a lot of why that wasn't successful for me, it works for a lot of people, but it was almost about detaching from your pain, like being a witness to it. And I get that can be helpful, but I think we have to do that after we embrace it and be with it and examine it. And then we can, once we let the emotion wash over us, we are different as a result, and we can see more clearly, and we can get to the heart of that pain. Because a lot of the pain on top is, whether it's anger or resentment, is actually, I almost say it's kind of like if you eat a chocolate, like there's that gooey center of the chocolate, but there's that hard outer crust. And often the pain we're feeling is that hard outer crust that is preventing us from softening into something that we really need to examine. And when we detach from that, we never get to that center.
Yeah, I think compassion is so, so important. Like if you just have the observation and the witnessing without the compassion, like you said, there's something missing. It's the being able to sit with it and just be like, this hurts. It's hard being a human. Oh my God, it's painful for me. This is so painful. And just being able to like sit with that. Like, it's hard being human.
I always say this human gig is no joke, I always joke that's why we come out of the womb crying. I signed up for this again, But that, again, is that tension of opposites to me. To be able to sit in the difficulty is strength, right? The softening is strength. And it's this interesting thing, not to name specific names, but we're talking about this at a time where Tony Robbins was just kind of, this video that he did was saying that the Me Too movement was about, people being victims, right? And this coming from someone who is a male, is in a position of power in our culture, right? He's white, he's male, he's wealthy, he's telling us what we want to hear. And again, I haven't really studied, like I have never done any of his work. So it's not about that, but it's just about the statement when we can be victimized, but not be victims. And we have to be with our pain so that we can see that we can be strong and deal with it because of it, right? Not that nothing bad happened to us. The strongest people I know are the people who've been able to open up to life after going through some stuff, right? Going through the fire. And that softness to me is the strength.
Yeah. And how have you done that in your life? Like, what can you share, like any sort of type of experience or method or way, like when shit hits the fan, what you do?
Yeah. Well, I ran away from it for a really long time, which is why I spent 8 years in school trying to figure out how I didn't know that fighting food was actually about unresolved trauma, right? Like, why didn't anybody tell me this? And I want to say that trauma, we tend to think of trauma as it has to be these big things. Yes, having had cancer, like which I did when as a teenager, is a big thing. But I'm defining trauma more as any time our needs have not been met when we needed them to be met. And specifically with food, it's around safety. It's feeling safe, not only physically, but emotionally. And part of our health is feeling like we belong, right? That's really important. When we were tribal people, if you didn't belong, you were usually left, and no one, and especially in America where we're filming, recording this, it's such an individualistic culture. But the truth is we need each other. And so, I, in my own life for 18 years, I was struggling with my weight and I hated my body. And I was, I call it truths of food because we use war metaphors in our culture. And those aren't just words. Like, we literally approach, like the chemotherapy that saved my life was also what was used in an atomic bomb to kill, right? Like, it's the metaphors I could go on, but I thought I was supposed to be strong by moving on, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's what you do. And granted, there were other things there. I was in middle school. I wanted to be normal. I didn't want to be the person who was, throwing up on the weekends and missing all the parties and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But we often think of these survivors as like, oh my God, you just moved on and all that stuff. And what I actually had to do was go back and revisit how terrifying it was when everything I thought I knew was no longer the same. And as a result, uncertainty in general, because I never went back and healed that at the time. And to the defense of the Western medicine system and compassion for myself, I'm the first generation of childhood cancer survivors. So they were just really happy that we were alive. And I'm
Right.
grateful for that as
Right.
well.
Right.
Now there's a lot more visual imagery support and a lot more, let's look at this. But at the time, it was just like, no, you want to move on, and I think probably people who are in the older generation, can relate to that as well. As like, you don't talk about things. It's best to just suck it up, whether it's, some of my clients diminish their trauma of like, well, everyone grew up in a divorced family, or everyone has struggled with body image issues or whatever. But that again is another way of not having to deal with the pain. It's what I call noble resistance, which is like, I shouldn't need to worry about this. This is a first world problem, but all of that stuff, is to protect us from going back into the pain.
Mm-hmm.
And so kind of fast forwarding, what I realized is with uncertainty, when it happens to me these days, when something doesn't go as I think it's going to be, when I learn new things about the effects of my chemotherapy 25 years ago, that I have to reorient, even though I've done so much to heal my body and heal the trauma of that. It's rather than reacting right away, it's sitting with it. And then knowing my choices. At the time, I was 13 and my parents did what Western medicine thought. And my cancer happens to be very effective with chemotherapy. But in subsequent issues, like when I had really bad depression and irritable bowel syndrome, Western medicine couldn't help me. And I needed to sit with it and say, what's the message here? And then look at different choices. And that's how I found food as a natural healer. That's how I looked at the emotional emptiness and I sat with it, and it made me leave my corporate career and want to switch jobs. And so those are kind of the long-term ways. But these days when I feel uncertain, I sit with it. I reach out to people who can understand and who aren't going to try to fix it, who just will witness it and say, yeah, that's hard, And then the paradox is, as when you sit with that, and someone else doesn't try to fix you, you tap into your own intuition and resourcefulness, which then just builds up the strength again, I don't know, I've kind of gone on, but.
Right. No, I get it. It's like, it's like I always say in meditation, like trainings or practices or teachings, that the observing is the dissolving. And it's like what you're saying, that embracing the pain dissolves it. And there isn't really anything to do. It's like so liberating when we realize like there's nothing to do. We can just be with, or like move with it or move through it versus like move on. And in some ways it's like extremely frustrating because it doesn't make the pain go away, right? So like if there's something really painful going on in our lives and then we just sit with it, eventually sitting with it does take the edge off and it dissolves it more quickly than like shuffling it up, putting it under the rug and letting it surface in other ways. But it doesn't make it go away fast, And it's like, I think there's such an amazing practice that like opening ourselves up to be this container of experience, that we can have grief and loss and joy, and we can have all of these different ingredients in there and just be with them. And there isn't anything we have to do, fix, understand, figure out, change necessarily.
You just brought up another tension of opposite / paradox that I love, is that I actually think to go fast, we need to go slow, and to go fast, to go slow, go fast. And, I think about again, looking at the lens of my work, a lot of my clients have tried the quick fix of diets, of someone else telling them, because I don't believe one diet works for everyone. I don't believe there's one formula. And Truth with Food is really a framework for figuring it out. And it takes about 6 months just to get that solid framework down. And I say, this is a quicker fix. It's not the quick fix, but if you think about how long you've been dieting or how long you've been rushing, right? When you rush, even with like overworking, you often have to redo it or you don't get the insights. And I think that comes back to, again, being in a very hyper masculine culture. And by masculine, I'm thinking the yang archetype of linear and thinking and valuing those above cycles and space and emotion and intuition. I often wonder, like, what we think is the quick fix or fast, like, how are we measuring that? Just because there's relief, there's kind of a temporary relief, right? But often in the long run, it creates more pain.
Right. Right. Yeah. Do you have any experiences that you would, or stories you'd want to share about your work with clients?
Yeah, I would love that. I think one of those examples is I can think of a client who took this. I have a program called Why Am I Eating This Now? And it only works on the emotional aspect of stuff. It only looks at these patterns. And this was a client who had a lot of digestive issues. And she had tried, Tums and reflux stuff. And, we all, I mean, at least I had tried everything Western because I found this other way is just a little, it's becoming more and more popular, right? But it's not kind of the holistic way is not often what is sold in magazines or whatnot, because it's slow and it's ancient, right? We're kind of like, I feel like what I'm doing is just putting a modern language to ancient wisdom. And it's nothing like brand new, like new superfoods, right? It's like, no, it's like the uninteresting thing, but the solid thing is like real food, mostly plants, high quality, healthy fats if you need animal protein. But I'm kind of going off on a tangent. But so she took the program at 6 weeks and really started to see these patterns that had been lifelong. And I always say that, our digestive issues, there's a physical component, you have to heal your gut, but there's also how are we emotionally digesting life? And in 6 weeks of just starting to see the patterns and starting to change them, her digestive issues went away. And it wasn't the quick, instant stuff that we often take I used to have heartburn when I had irritable bowel syndrome, right? It kind of like alleviates the pain, but you start to realize, okay, you're wearing away your gut lining and all this kind of stuff in the long run, right? But having her able to see how one of the ways that she was comfort eating, one of the patterns that she had was to avoid. And by avoiding it, it was actually making it more intense and then more dramatic and more hard to deal with, right? And so by starting to just embrace hard things and making different choices, her digestion, she's like, I can't believe this. Like, you're not a GI doctor. And I'm like, no. And sometimes you need to see a GI doctor, right? But I think that we often think that subtle is very profound. I think often we think in America, go big or go home, or push yourself outside your comfort zone. But sometimes pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone is surrendering and being and doing subtle things, not trying to go all in and gear up for the boot camp, for the 30-day yoga challenge, the 30-day cleanse.
Yeah. It's almost like, I feel like that's like the opposite direction of the direction we should be going in. It's like, it's like the thing that's coming to mind is like, the huge, like, plant medicine journey, like, that kind of thing versus like, what if we just took a little break right now and listened to what the trees had to tell us? Like it's a listening. Like you said, it's a surrender. And subtle things are the most powerful right now.
Totally. And you need someone who can champion you in that container, because, I'm thinking of another client. She was someone who came to me frustrated with food, and of course, but when we did her health history, she had a very traumatic upbringing, and then unstable home life, then was moved because of it and was severely bullied and marginalized. A lot of my clients are marginalized by being bullied, either for their weight or just because it was random. And then she went in and had a health issue, and they accidentally gave her way too much prednisone. It was like 10 times the amount. Yeah.
So strong.
Yeah. And then she starts having anxiety, and they tell her she has ADHD, and then they put her on birth control. And so she's been dealing with these patterns, right? And has normalized them for 15 years. And I start with like, okay, we're going to figure out what your story is. And she was someone who had a hard time around uncertainty because of all the uncertainty that had been very traumatic in her life. And we took like 6 months, but in 6 months, she was down to the lowest ADHD medication. And she's working with her therapist to completely get off of it. She got off birth control. Things that had been troubling her, like sleep, had gone away. She started to lose weight naturally on her own. She is feeling things more intensely off the birth control, right? Which she like loves, right? Even though we said that that's a bad thing. Oh, you're so emotional. But she had tried. And again, she's like, I didn't know any of this beforehand. And I was like, she's like, I'm so angry now. And I'm like, good. I'm like, this is how I felt when I had tried 4 different antidepressants, all these, heartburn medications, all this kind of stuff. And I said, we have to start realizing that these symptoms are messages, and it takes a lot longer to deal with that. But now she's someone who knows how her body works. It doesn't see it as a deficit that she has these certain diagnoses, but has moved through them tenderly, subtly, yet so profoundly. Like her life is completely different now. And even the effect of feeling so much more powerful in your body is starting to think like, she's now thinking like, does my career need shifted? Is this like what I want to be doing? And that took 6 to 8 months to get there. But the results in that 6 to 8 month time frame were beyond what she was really looking for. And I think of a lot of my clients are struggling with depression when they come to me. And yes, we need to heal their gut. But when we look and balance their blood sugar, but when we look at the emotional stuff, if we look at depression as a message, it's like, oh my God, there's some things that are out of alignment here. And when they start making these subtle changes, they work with their doctors to get off their antidepressants, but within a year, they feel so much better than they did on antidepressants, and their life is different, and they have the skills and tools now to deal with hard things. And that source of depression or that emptiness that they've now filled is one of the things that they're most proud of. But it takes time,
but it's like what you said, the slow track is the fast track. It feels slow, but it's in the slowing down and the alchemizing and the letting everything move around in that container that it's actually quite fast. I mean, if you look at like a chemical reaction, right? It's pretty fast actually. And you're just basically sitting in one spot. So you allow that reaction to occur, right?
Yeah. I'm like, these patterns, sometimes it can feel slow, but I'm like, if you've been dealing with these patterns for 2 decades and you can reverse them in 6 months to a year, like that's pretty incredible. The challenge is comparing when you see someone, on Facebook who's like, oh my God, I've lost 10 pounds in 10 days, and it's like, okay, maybe in that moment of time, but like what time frame are we measuring, right? That can be challenging, but that's part of, I always say, trusting ourselves is the obstacle and the path, and in trusting our way and our timing.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about weight and food and why am I eating this now? So when you're working with people, do you recommend that they like just take a moment and ask themselves like, why am I eating this right now?
Like, that's a great question. So actually, no. So there's 2 things. I mean, first you have to look at the food piece. In our extreme culture, we lose nuance, right? So the diet culture says it's all about the food and willpower. And then the holistic side of things say, oh, it's only about the emotional stuff. And the reality is it's both. How you feel influences what you choose to eat, and what you choose to eat influences how you feel.
Definitely.
So with the food start is I actually do experiments, right? A lot of people aren't living in their bodies, and we use your flower essences in my programs, and it's such a fun, joyful way for them to get back in their bodies, right? The senses that they have when they spritz those, and I give in my programs, people get like as a gift gift, they get your, I pick based on intuition what I'm feeling, but then everyone follows up. They're like, I ordered like 10 of those. I love them, And part of the magic is they're getting getting back in their body in that presence. But I give people food experiments on the food aspect so that they can start to see, I'm going to feel this in my body, right? In our health world, we tend to say, oh, if you eat well, you're going to live 10 years longer, but that's actually not really inspiring for adults. But if you can tell them, hey, you're going to sleep better tonight, you're going to feel better, you're not going to crash at your computer, like the incentive starts to come internally. And that starts to build trust that, hey, my body's not broken, I'm not broken. And about 50% of emotional eating is actually people not eating the right things for themselves. They think they are because they've listened to experts. They've listened to a lot of trends, right? I mean, diet trends are like fashion trends, right? They come and they go, and we think we're doing something so new, but it's like, okay, it's kind of like when I found yoga in 1999 in Boston in a YMCA basement. And I said to my mom, I found this cool new thing called yoga. And she's like, Allie, I did that in the 60s, I was like, you did? She's like, yeah, it's not really new. And I was like, oh my God, I had no idea. I'm 19.
Thousands of years old.
Yeah, exactly. But then in terms of the emotional stuff, a lot of the things that people are taught is that it's about the food. How can you resist the food more? Don't go to a party hungry. Take a deep breath. Breathe, back to that mindfulness-based stress reduction course. They gave us raisins and we were supposed to taste them and enjoy them. The problem is when you're eating I call it eating out of alignment, because sometimes you want to eat something junky. Who cares? That's the one time you do it, is not it's when there's shame and you keep doing it, is to actually slow down that, what we call the automatic pilot, or that compulsive drive. And so what we look at is what I call the auto eating spiral. And there are 4 components to that. There's a trigger, there's and all of this can happen within seconds, or it could build all day and why people eat at night, or it could build a whole week and then you go on the weekend. But there's an emotional trigger. For the one client I was telling you about, uncertainty was her trigger. For some of my clients, it's inadequacy. And then there's a story that we attach to that. So it's not that we feel uncertainty or that we feel inadequate or that we feel lonely. It's, what does that mean? Does it mean that I just failed? Does it mean that I'm going to be rejected, right? It's the meaning that we attach to it. And that starts to feel so intense. And then we have a stress response because we feel wrong in that moment. And again, this happens very slowly. We slow this down like week by week because it's happening so quickly. And there's a stress response, and there's different patterns. I call them your comfort eating patterns of then how we frame a situation as a result of feeling wrong in that moment. And then we have behaviors, and then we eat out of alignment. So by trying to so we're focusing on you and your power and what triggers you, because food doesn't have that much power, right? Like I always say to my clients when they're like, what do I do about trigger foods? I'm like, there were times in your life when you could pass up the pizza. There were times in your life where brownies weren't your favorite thing at night. What has changed is where you're feeling vulnerable and at risk, emotionally at risk usually in your life. And we have to look at that because that's what's triggering you. And because you feel powerless because of how you're experiencing the situation, food numbs out that sensation of powerlessness. And by power, I mean choice. I don't mean the kind of power that we tend to not like in our world, right? Like war and yielding power over people. I mean, do I have a choice in how I respond in this moment? And so, but we have to get present. The challenge, and maybe I'm going too much down a rabbit hole, is that part of being in the present, we bring the past with us. So I use the example of like a toothbrush, right? Like if you woke up every morning and you just saw your toothbrush and you were like, what is this thing? Like what, what does it do? Why is it near my sink? We would never get out the door in the morning. And so this is a very valuable evolutionary tool to bring meaning to things. The problem is when we bring a wounded meaning to things and things actually we don't need to be wounded in that moment, right? But we were wounded at one time, but because we never went back and healed that part of our story, we are now recreating it. It's stuck there. And so, it's causing the battle with food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about nighttime eating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's a big thing for people.
sweet things. And like, I mean, I think, I imagine that if I need sweet things, it must be because I need sweet things, like, like that kind of, I don't know if it's like affection or self-compassion or love, but then it somehow turns into literal sweet things.
Yeah, well, and I love that you brought up that intermediate of connection or something else. And another thing that you said is like, maybe I just need sweet things. For a lot of my clients, these patterns have been going on so long that they don't see it as a cause and effect. They see it, this is who I am. No, I just love sweets and I need them at night, right? That tends to be, and I'm like, and that's part of why they start to feel broken. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they can't see the stages of what's actually triggering them. They assume it's them, not the trigger itself, and that kind of auto-eating spiral domino. So in terms of nighttime eating, and it is very different based on the person, but there's two root causes. One is imbalanced blood sugar. So most people, if you think of your blood sugar, it's kind of like, I used to use a roller coaster metaphor, but I think sometimes financial metaphors are really good. If we don't eat in alignment for what's best for our body for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you've basically withdrawing a balance during the day. And so by the time you come to the evening, we're usually so famished, so depleted, because Americans tend to be very malnourished, but overfed. So
Jeez, yeah.
so you can eat a lot, but still your body can still be
Mhm,
starving.
mhm.
And hunger doesn't just show up in our stomach. It shows up in our focus, in our energy, our
Right.
able to be calm. So if we have been feeling stressed or really tightly wound all day, it's in part because we're not getting the right nutrients to help us feel calm and balanced and satiated and have stamina. So there's a little bit of that going on. But then the other piece, there's two reasons that people tend to overeat at night is one, they start rehashing the entire day and questioning themselves. Oh my God, did I say that right? Oh my God, that email, I didn't get that email back. Did I phrase it the right way? Right. And this is where I say most of my clients, they think they're self-aware, but it's more self-conscientiousness and
Mm,
self-consciousness and
mhm,
self-criticalness, right?
mhm.
And we confuse that for self-awareness versus why am I feeling this way? It's like, did I do the right thing? Or, oh my God, I didn't get that back, or I'm not doing enough. Or some of my clients come home and they're like, I have so much personal stuff to do and I'm depleted. And so they eat to procrastinate on that stuff, right? So it's often either us, there's different reasons we do with our comfort eating styles. We all have a different style and reason. And I have a quiz on my website that people can start to learn more about their style. But it tends to be because of one of those styles, or there's actually space. And all of those emotions and those sensations that we've been running from start to come up in that space. And that's when, some people, it may not be eating, it may be Netflix, it may be social media, right? But, I joke kind of social media is like a dopamine factory, right? It's not until we compare ourselves and then we're like, oh my God, this is awful. But it's helping us from not feel that down feeling or from all those intense emotions coming up. And so what we resist persists. And it often comes back in such an overwhelming way that if we can learn to be with it in the moment, it can actually strengthen us rather than weaken us when we are running from it.
Yeah, and I think things really quickly become patterns. I notice like, you know, if I'm like, oh, I'm tired, I need a break. Oh, I'll have some. I'm like a huge fan of chocolate. I eat so much dark chocolate. And
I love chocolate too.
that's like the one thing that I just like I let myself have as much dark chocolate as I want. Like in some ways liberating. And then in other ways, you can develop patterns. Like I noticed just recently, like, oh, interesting. I'm eating sweet things like right before I go to bed. And because it's like the only window of time for me. And so I actually like what you said about why am I eating these things? Like, because sometimes things become so much of a pattern and very quickly. Like you might eat something today and then by tomorrow at that same time, you're like, where's that thing like I had yesterday? And then like 3 weeks later, you're like, oh, I have this extra little jelly roll around my waist. Like, where did that come from? Oh, right. I've been eating like stuff before I go to sleep. Like right, but I love what you said about like, it would be kind of nice to stop and ask, like, why am I eating this? Like, is it because because I haven't eaten breakfast for how many weeks? Or is it because something's going on internally? Or is it because I need a break and this is the only way I'm like allowing myself to have an hour to myself? Is there something else I'd rather be doing with that time? Like,
Yeah. And knowing what questions to ask, I think, is really important, because some of the big questions that people are given in this food freedom world is like, well, is it worth it? And it's like, well, in the moment, yeah, it really is. It really is worth it. But it's worth it usually because of these patterns that have been building all day. And I love your example of dark chocolate. If we want to look at things energetically from a traditional Chinese medicine standpoint, chocolate has dairy and sugar in it, and that's very expansive. It's the yin archetype, right? So if this is the only time we have to ourselves, it's going to overcompensate for how little space, right? It's a really potent, now like 1 or 2 squares, who cares, right? But if we feel out of control with it, it's serving some other purpose and metaphorical purpose. And dairy is very mothering, very yin, right? It's giving us the space, right?
I can't do dairy. It's so...
Me either. Sometimes I take the hit, but cheese is hard for me. Like, of all, I'm gluten intolerant. I don't miss gluten, but sometimes cheese, man, it's like, oh, I do love it. But for some people, ice cream at night is huge for them, right?
Yeah.
So, but it's that, and when it starts to become a habit, it's grounding, it's a ritual, right? And it's getting us back in our bodies because we're taught to unattach from them, unattach from our sensations. I remember a yoga teacher that I really admired when I lived in Philadelphia said, she no longer taught the Bhagavad Gita in yoga, or because it was written by men for men. And and I think of the Buddha as a man, and all of even our spiritual traditions are influenced by this male lens of unattachment. And again, the masculine archetype of unattachment, discipline. But if you look at the feminine or the yin, it's like joy and pleasure and sensation. And most of our spiritual traditions aren't influenced by the feminine. And after she told me that, I was like, oh my God, this is why the body is thought of as like, you need to discipline it versus embrace it and ride the wave, That's kind of really big picture, but it translates into using food to get back into our bodies, because that makes us feel grounded. I mean, our bodies are our home. Can you imagine never feeling like you have a sense of home?
Right. Yeah, and it'd be nice if we have that like time of the day when we need something, we could maybe like flip it on its head and give ourselves that all throughout the day. So like if I'm craving something sweet at night, I remember I used to go to see this Chinese medicine doctor who would give me like a tincture of sweet herbs to take throughout the day. Or I mean, maybe it's something as simple as like having a cup of licorice tea that's just really sweet. Like throughout the day, it's like you're giving yourself that sweet. Like you're over, like you're not waiting until you're just like, super depleted and you just need something. It's like, I'm going to do this every couple hours. I'm just going to like lavish this on myself because I need it.
Yeah, I think a really like practical tip for people is to pay attention to transitions. They tend to be when we get the most depleted. So like coming home from work to evening, or when we're about to go to bed, or even like going from a meeting to an event, that tends to be like, I use the word depletion a lot with my clients. Those tend to be like, oh my God, am I doing the right thing? Am I gearing up? And often, even after meals, we don't even take the time to transition. We just go right into things. So I think like like when you're ending a meal, doing something like tea or even decaf chai. Chai is really good for helping with sweet cravings. Adding more bitter flavors are also really good. But if you have, but if you have like a hot drink to like help you in those transitions, and notice the transitions, and notice that you want to be more resilient as you're heading into those. And sometimes just taking 15 minutes to like ground yourself again, like getting away. Again, a lot of clients are like measuring productivity in terms of time spent. But if we like, what if my outcome, like if I take 10 minutes to even get outside and like get some sunshine on my face, like what replenishes me, I think, is a really good question for those transition times. And also using licorice tea or decaf chai if it's after lunch, because caffeine tends to take a long time to get out of people's systems. But using sort of something to transition out of meals and to transition using a hot beverage or something grounding that will replenish you during the day, then you kind of you think of a battery, you come into the evening at like 50% and you can like make the healthy choice, versus if you're coming in at like 20%. Like everyone has a different threshold that, like, I always tell my clients, think of yourself as a battery. What threshold are you like, I am not making the healthy choice. Like I am just going for it, right? Because if you are super depleted, the food's going to give you energy to get back up to that level. So that's another thing people can start to do is like, think of yourself as a battery, like battery level. And like, what is your threshold? Whereas if I get below that, like I'm going for the sweets and the chocolate, versus if I can prevent that during the day and come into the time that trips me up. Because for a lot of people, for you, it might be before bed. A lot of my clients, it's from work to home. How do I make sure I'm fortified before that? Because life is really energy management more than time management.
Yeah, I think it's really common these days that we're not fully in like nourishment mode. Like I really love this idea of like, how can I nourish myself all day long? Like if it's like spending the extra money, even though it's expensive to go and get that green juice, because I didn't have enough time to have vegetables. And so I'm just going to like, this is what my body needs for nourishment right now. Or I just need a 5-minute break right now. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm going to go sit outside for 5 minutes. Like what is it that we have gotten into this spiraling habit of depletion? And it's like, it seems interesting that, there aren't as many micronutrients in our diet. So we are literally, physically, probably in some ways depleted, needing more vegetables and things like that. And then we have this emotional habit of not necessarily just like totally like giving ourselves as much nourishment as we want. It's like, how can we flip that so that like from morning till night, we're like, oh my gosh, aromatherapy oil, yummy. This smells so good. Oh, wow. I feel like a little like 5-minute break for hot tea. I'm going to do that. Ooh, what else do I need right now? I need to go jump around and dance for 5 minutes. Okay, I'm going to do that. Like, how do we get ourselves to like flip into nourishment?
I love that. I have a couple of ideas. I think first we have to redefine what nourishment is. Again, I think in our perfectionist culture, which is really about safety, right? Safety, perfectionism drives this all or nothing, right? So it's like we think nourishment is going away to a spa for a week, and people are like, I did so well eating there. And I'm like, well, all of your stress was gone, of course, like that's not what, if you have no stress, you can. But I think remembering that subtle is profound, and that we just need those 5-minute breaks. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And I think the second thing is redefining what nourishment is. For a lot of people, stress builds up because we don't reach out to a friend when we need to, when we're struggling, right? Like even just like a 5-minute call, or getting out in the sunshine, right? Which is free, right? It's these like basic things that we tend to really struggle and feel depleted when we don't feel like we have a sense of belonging, right? At work, in our communities. Like we go on, take social media, for example, right? We're feeling stressed out or depleted, and then we go on there and we compare ourselves to that. And it's like, we think we're giving ourselves a break, but we're really comparing. We're taking this mental frame to social media, versus what if I actually just called a friend and said, hey, how are you doing? It's like kind of like so 80s. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, but like landlines and stuff like that. But like doing these subtle things that actually give us such an energy boost back. Or even doing nourishment can be having a big to-do list and just focusing on one of those things, right? Like cutting your sense of what nourishment is. Like I think self-care has to deepen into this. I'm going to be compassionate with myself, and compassion is hardcore, right? Like to get off of, if I have a to-do list of 10 things, which often are self-imposed deadlines, and say, I'm not going to keep up with the Joneses, metaphorically. And I'm going to go with my own timing and my own rhythm and have my natural resting point. That was a big thing where, I'm running Truths with Food right now. And one client was like, I've always just gone by my to-do list rather than turning into my own rhythm and having a natural stopping point. And I think we start doing this by tuning in. Again, often because we're self-conscious or we're self-critical, we're like responding to everybody else and their needs. And that's part of the comfort eating patterns sometimes, is kind of accommodating what's happening on the outside world. But I think we have to stop with, what is my agenda for the day? And not in a selfish way, right? We tend to think this is like a win-lose situation, but tuning in with ourselves and even identifying what we need. I had one of my clients start doing that, and she's like, this is revolutionary. She's like, I've never stopped to tune in to say, what do I need here? It's just kind of like, I'm saying yes, I'm keep going. I'm just like reacting rather than strategizing.
Totally.
So I kind of went off and around and about, but I think it's knowing that we have needs. The body has needs, right? Like plants and flowers, we need water, sunshine.
It's pretty simple, isn't it? I mean, it's like these days we're trying to do so much. And I love what you were saying about social media. Like I have that feeling often of, like I'm going. And then I'm like, I pick up my phone and I'm like, I'm just going to lie down in my bed for like 10 minutes and just check Instagram and see like, what do I need to answer? What do I need, as if that's a break. And then I catch myself like, I'm doing this to like take a break. This is not a break. Like, actually, I could do nothing, like less, down to like, I could just lie here and do nothing. I could just lie down and do nothing. And then like to your point about what do I need? It's like, okay, I need a break. Is social media going to help that? Or like, I'm hungry. Am I really hungry or am I just thirsty? Like maybe I need a glass of water, but I'm just eating something because I feel like my body needs something, but I'm not taking a break enough to be in tune enough to know that actually it's water that I really need.
Yeah. And I would say that's part of the reaction is we take the first answer, right? Of like, I need chocolate. It's like, wait a second, let me just, and I always tell my clients, like sometimes, as we're reducing the tension and by transforming this auto eating spiral with them. So in the beginning, they're still going to overeat or whatever. But I'm like, if you can stay with that discomfort for like one more minute than the next time, you will start to get amazing insight. You will get layers and deeper understanding. So sit with it, give yourself the space of what do I need? And I love that you brought about social media because I had this huge like aha for myself. And it doesn't mean I get it all the time, but I would go on social media when I was already depleted. If we think about that battery metaphor.
Totally.
And it would hook me into the exhaustion that I was already feeling. And so it was kind of like, let's just keep this up because I'm really comfortable running myself into the ground, right? A lot of my clients, they feel nervous when they have energy left because they're like, what did I miss, right? What have I not figured? Like, why do I still have energy today? But I realized that if I can do social media, actually, when I have energy left in the tank, I have more agency or choice over it because I'm not depleted. So I can look at it, not feel bad. I don't compare. I'm just like, I'm doing this here because it's kind of like the difference of 8 hours sleep versus 4 hours of sleep, right? You're like, life looks so different on 8 hours of sleep versus 4 hours of sleep, right? So if you are going on social media with a battery of like 8, right? It's like, I'm happy for these people. This is exciting. And then I can leave it versus if I'm already exhausted, it's like just feeding into that downward spiral that is just, we end with overwhelm and just like exhausting ourselves versus having a healthy lens on it. I don't know. Is that clear?
Yeah. I mean, what's really clear, I think, is that in this culture right now, we are heavily into depletion and it's like it's become a kind of relatively comfortable place for us to just run ourselves into the ground. And it takes some considerable effort to soften into allowing ourselves to receive a little more.
Yeah. And I think it's, a lot of the work I do with clients is changing to a new identity. And we have to be willing to leave the productive, busy identity behind. And, that is one metric. But I always encourage my clients, let's pay attention to actually the outcome that you want. What if you can get what you want, the success you want, and all that stuff with, I always use the samurai example. Like the samurai knows exactly when to strike, right? He or she is not flailing along and just like punching and choking it like every time. It's like, no, I'm going to read the energy and my intuition and like, be very precise and use precision.
Right.
And I think we can do that. I mean, there is so much going on right now. I don't want to dismiss that the world is in transition, one big transition right now. And we can make our days a little bit more graceful and easier on ourselves if we can realize that busy isn't the main metric. It's like, what are my outcomes? And it may take me, quote unquote, a little longer, but am I going to enjoy the process? And ultimately, isn't that what's rejuvenating?
Right. And I think also that it's a big lesson to take in what's good for me is good for other people too. Like we tend to run ourselves thin doing things for other people. But when we actually really take in what is good for me is good for everyone else too. Like it's not like I'm doing this for me, which is then depleting somebody else, right? It's like mutually nourishing.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up though, that in the comfort eating patterns, one of them, the mental construct is either or. It's like win-lose, right? It's like, if I take time for myself, then but that's not true, right? Like when you replenish the earth, right? When like, everybody benefits when we replenish ourselves, and it prevents burnout, resentment, anger, right down the road. And I think most people really do enjoy being generous. However, when we come, when we come from a depleted place, we actually don't have the capacity to be generous. We're giving out of guilt, out of obligation, and we're not giving our best strengths and gifts and talents. We're giving kind of the like default, like, ugh, whatever you say, or or like, like when we have energy, we bring so much of a creative twist and flair to how we can help and how we can give. And so it really can be win-win. And I think that's coming up with those creative solutions as part of the fun. But yeah, most people do not lose when we take care of ourselves.
Yeah, and I like what you were saying before too about knowing that we have a specific limit. Like we have this many hours in the day that we're going to work, for example. So then it really pushes you to prioritize. Okay, what are those 1 or 3 things that really absolutely are the most important, and what can I just let go of? And instead of just like hacking down the do go, and then you try to do as much as you can, and then you're just trashed.
Yeah, because if you think about like a to-do list, like if you have like 3 things on it, some of it can be fun, right? It's like can be enjoyable. But then if you had 10 things, now you're just racing through it, right? And you don't get that creative insight or whatnot. It's just everything is rushed versus like, let me enjoy this. So yeah, prioritizing. And again, I also think there's cycles, being a nature expert, sometimes there's a winter season and we just need to rest, in terms of certain things. And, I just launched a new website, and it's like, okay, there was building, like I could see the cycles of it, like planning and all this stuff. And now it's like, I'm taking a break because, me like pulling back a little bit is like necessary for me to sustain continuing on.
Right.
I want to make one important point though, for people listening who want to tap into their own needs. It's also really important that you get clear on the other person's needs or the project's needs or the expectations, because often we assume we know. And if we are perfectionists, we overgive, we overperform, we build up because we're trying to do it over excellent, right? That's like the safe measure to like overperform, over deliver. And so often we think there isn't enough time or we have to do it all because we don't even know what the other person needs or the expectations of the project. For example, I have a client, she's an attorney, and she felt all this pressure to get all her assignments back right away. And I said, why don't you ask the partner what the deadline is rather than assume? And it was like, oh my God, she had so much more time than she was assuming, right? And then she could relax. She could bring more like of her intelligence and her enjoyment to the process rather than I'm already behind with this and there's so many things to do. But asking people like what they need. And often it's like, I'm thinking in interpersonal relationships, it's people just need us to listen. And we're sitting there trying to fix it. And we're doing all the stuff that actually isn't that helpful. And we make life a lot harder on ourselves. So not only do we need to get clear on what other people need, but we need to ask other people what they need as well. Or if it's a project, getting clear on the expectations and what's important to other people as well. And then find that win-win, because that win-win is in many places that we're just not exploring, because we think we know what we need. We think we know what the other person needs, and no one's really getting clear. And believe it or not, this is why people eat. I know this sounds so tangential, but this is why people comfort eat, because of their stress and overwhelm and the patterns of how they approach that, rather than getting clear on everyone's needs in the situation.
Mm. Yeah. Let's just talk about softening for a minute.
One of my favorite words.
Yeah. When do you apply softening in your life, and how? I know that what's one of the things that is really important to you, and where we definitely overlap, is talking about how to bloom from our wounds. How do you use softening to catalyze that process?
Yeah. So to let me kind of set this up and be clear, is that what a lot of people refer to in the food or the coaching industry as your inner critic, or in the food industry, your inner rebel. I actually, when you study that more deeply, it's actually a protective side of ourselves, right? The critical thoughts are preventing us from putting ourselves at risk. When we're judging other people, it's because we feel threatened. And when we're rebelling, we're actually rebelling against being put in a really tiny space. But we put ourselves there because we're afraid of putting ourselves at risk. So I say that because this wounded side of ourselves, which I refer to as our inner protector, has this very crusty edge. And I joke, and Anne Lamott used this term shitty first draft. So whenever...
Oh God, I love that. That's the best chapter.
Yeah. Isn't it?
If anyone's writing anything, you just need to go get the book. What is it?
Writing to the bones or something like that. Or is it
Bird by Bird?
Yeah, Bird by Bird. I can't remember. My husband's a writer, so I have so many writing books.
Yeah.
Play it hard.
And you just read that one chapter, shitty first
draft.
Yeah,
shitty first drafts. And so I say your inner protector does this really defensive, it could be anger, resentful, guilty, shitty first draft. And so the way that I soften is like, okay, this is how I'm seeing it now. Like sometimes I need to walk away for 5 minutes. If it's an email, I go back after an hour, because I literally in an email will have focused on the things that I'm afraid that I did wrong. And kind of, I will read it through that lens. And then when I go back and read the email, I'm like, oh my God, there was 3 sentences here that I missed, right? But that protective side of ourselves is always on guard for not wanting to be wrong. So giving ourselves time, I think, is really important. And in Truths with Food, and Why Am I Eating This Now, we use music a lot, or our flower essences. How can we soften into not reacting right away? Because you want to react, right? You want to be like, or just lash out at the person or whatnot. It's really hard to sit with things. So I soften by space and time. Either it's space by walking and giving space in my body, and a chance for that shitty first draft of emotion to wash over me, kind of like the ocean washes over rocks, right? And okay. And then I have to really think about okay, what do I need here? This is what this person said. Where am I in clear? Because often that protective side of ourselves doesn't get any more information. It feels exposed. So I always want to know, what more information do I need? What the information that I'm hearing, this is not the end of the story, right? In Truths with Food, we call it closing the story loop. We're going to be we make quick conclusions, or, this is how it always is, or this is how they are, versus saying, wait a second here, let's stay open, right? That's the softening part of
curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah. Curiosity. And then assuming the best, right? Because what you start to realize is my clients will be like, oh my God, I can see other people's inner protectors lashing out. They don't know that, but we're all kind of these wounded 6, 7, 8-year-olds dressed up in adult bodies. Really, we are.
Mm-hmm.
And especially men, right? Men are not allowed to feel this at all. So we can see that often they do the most wounding, because they this part of them, they're projecting outwards. So that's how I really soften, is first stay with the discomfort and realize that this anger and resentment and guilt is protecting this deeper sense of, am I wrong? And did I do something wrong? And then being curious and opening. I think of a flower, the flower doesn't clench. It's okay, I'm going to keep trying to get the pollen, even though this bee is here. Like I'm gonna open and bloom. And every time we do that, because we're reacting, even like I said, the past is always with us, even though it's a present day situation, we're reacting in part to the past. So to kind of make this concrete, a lot of my clients have been bullied by other women. And so when there's groups of other women, they read a situation as very defensive, right? As that they're on the outside. Nothing might have happened, but that's how they're interpreting it. And so, one client was in yoga teacher training, and she's in the corporate world right now because she has to pay her bills, right? Like, and she's like, I feel like I'm not super yogi because I can't do yoga full time, right? And it's like, I said to her, well, first of all, like, you don't know who has family money, you don't, and that's fine, but like to we find a way to differentiate and make ourselves wrong and isolated in so many different ways. So it's like, wait, let's stay with this. What are the connections there that you have? You guys are all yogis. You have a lot in common, and that's softening into this is like, even though I'm not where I want to be, part of me is reacting to this situation because I was bullied and I was ostracized by girls way early on. So I'm bringing that past experience to the present. And so softening is like, what is true, what isn't, what's in the past. And again, it doesn't mean that we can trust everyone and that, but it's getting curious so that we can become discerning, not defensive.
Yeah, I loved what you said about space and time. I think that's such a commodity these days. And so often, like even just with text culture, we feel like we've got to answer right away. And we have, in some ways with social media, so much more access to people than we did before. And we're not used to waiting to see, until things pass. And so I think that can kind of clamp down on the opening that allows you to get to the curiosity, right? Space and time. It's like like the age-old healer, right?
Yeah, it is.
Sometimes it takes years for things.
Totally. And what's interesting is some of my clients, especially I think the older we are, right, the more, especially as women, we weren't taught to have needs. I say the millennial generation is like empowered, not entitled. Like they're just like, you guys, this culture is crazy. Like we're not putting up with this. But a lot of times people don't know what they need, right? Like they're like, I don't know. And when we give that space and time, the defensive side of us calms down and intuition arises. And that's why I always say to my clients, like, you are your best expert. You just have to give yourself the space and develop the trust that like kind of the first draft of what you're coming up with. No, like we know the biggest part of writing is rewriting, right? It's like the biggest part of listening is like waiting and listening and just being.
It's such a good skill, just waiting, right? It's a really good skill because I think oftentimes what happens too is we'll have the two voices. Like there's the whatever the suffering is going on, the pain or the loss or the longing or the soft part, like the soft suffering. And then you have the, like you said, the bossy one or the defensive one. Like, really, are you thinking about that again? Like you're on this again. Aren't you over this? Like, haven't we gone over this? Like how many times, right? And then you've got these two battling parts of you when if we could just soften into like, oh wow, there are a lot of different parts and like they all have their voice and there may be a whole other answer that lies within the space of waiting.
Yeah. And even though they're competing voices, they probably have a same need, right? They probably, I mean, I've learned with food, it's this need to be seen and recognized. And, it's this tension between feeling invisible and unimportant or being seen in the wrong way, right? It's like if we're not thin enough, if we're heavy, we're seen in the wrong way. But then if we're not pretty enough or thin enough, we are unimportant and invisible. And so, but it comes down to, even though that's the metaphor of our bodies, it comes down to having needs and it being okay to have messy human needs. Like that, I was talking to a client the other day and a friend of hers invited another friend for coffee and she was like, she called her up and she was like, hey, like, I feel bad that you don't ever want to have coffee with me. And the friend was like, oh, I'm so glad you said something to me. She's like, I just had coffee with the other friend because it was closer by. It has nothing to do with you, but like that protective side of ourselves makes up a story, right? But by her saying like, okay, you're doing this, really? Like, you're not going to invite me, or, and then, but having this need of like, but I really want to go to coffee because at the end of the day, I want to have a connection with you. And so it was still that need to have connection and belonging. It was just masked in this like really protective side of ourselves that comes across as very defensive and judgmental, not only to other people but also ourselves.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we can diffuse things by just making space for what it is that we need, and not that we always necessarily have to get it. We don't even have to get it. It's more like, wow, I feel like I really need this, and acknowledging it and recognizing it and realizing it. And then the actually getting of it becomes less important because we just acknowledged it.
You just said the $1 million point. Maybe $1 billion with inflation, or trillion, what are we at? Yeah, that's what I often say to my clients. It's like, what you start to learn is you don't even need things to go your way. You just need to know that you were seen and witnessed, and that's often half of it. I mean, a lot of times we do get our needs, but it's just like, oh, just that you heard me and I felt heard and seen, and that I mattered. Right.
Well, and I think that we so often we don't do that for ourselves. Like, witness ourselves, look at ourselves in what it is that we need, and have that be okay. And then also have it be okay if we don't get it.
Yeah, because we're resilient and we'll find something else that we need.
Right, because it's almost like, oh, I don't want to admit that that's what I really want, because like, what if I don't get it, and I probably won't get it, and so I'm just not even gonna like look at that, right?
Yeah, I do think there's a difference between needs and wants, though. And that I think the need, especially around belonging, to be seen and witnessed, and to your point, we have to belong to ourselves before we can know. Belonging to me is an emotional intimacy, connected over values. And if we don't know our own values and our own needs first, it can feel very empty, right? It's like we may have a lot of relationships, but we can still feel alone, right? Loneliness is not about if people are around you. It's like, do I feel connected? But then there's wants. And I think that's the fun part of the mystery of like, we think we want something, but like, really it's about who do we become in the process, right? So it's like, like I wanted there to be a better option for people who were really struggling with food than the options I had. And it's like, what I have created that, but it's like, who did I become in the process? And I could have never imagined all of the things that would have unfolded, and the wonderful people like you that I have met, and the network that I have. It's like, that wasn't even on my radar, right? It was just like, I have this want, and I want to be able to like dedicate my life to it. So I think there's kind of two different processes, but we have to start with what we need, because when we start with what we need, that totally reorients us. Because when we have that sense of belonging, especially, I think then we develop the courage and the bravery to go after what we want, because you do need to feel like, you have that tribe of people. I mean, even me, this is like, the Truth with Food is so out of the box. And I started to get so much more courage once I had more clients who were like, this is amazing, right? Like, and I want to do this. Because for me, I was like, does anybody want to do the hard work? Like, I was really like worried about that. I was like, this is challenging. And like,
Yep.
Does anybody really want to do this? Like, I wish I just could make green smoothie recipes. And we need people to make green smoothie recipes. So I don't mean that, like, that's just recipes, and that side is just not my calling. But as my clients were like, no, this is relieving. It's tough, but it's worthwhile. Then that gave me the courage to like go out more and more. So it's kind of a tangent, but I think knowing our needs really influences us in a new direction.
Yeah. And I wondered, so for people, for listeners who are just like, okay, give me the lowdown on, like, give me like your top 1 or 2 or 3 things for comfort eating. Like, what are you like, list out, like, what do you tell people?
Yeah. Well, so I always, like, I sound like a broken record on my own podcast. Like, you need to learn how to balance your blood sugar. And most people like are not eating enough fat. Like, if you're craving sweets, especially after a meal, that's usually a sign that you didn't get enough fat at your meal. And again, I often see too a clientele that has, like, their health has suffered the most under the low fat craze. So there's a lot of people who do really well on low fat diets. I just don't happen to work with them because they're
We
succeeding.
Just need fat for our brains.
Exactly. And it makes food taste good and all that kind of stuff. So I would say for comfort eating, believe it or not, try to get more healthy fats in for starters. And then the second thing is I think what we talked about is like in transition times, because they bring up a lot of uncertainty, whether you're going from a meeting to say like, did I just say the right thing? Now I have all this work. How am I going to do this? Or you're coming out of a meeting and you're like, I don't know how to do this, right? Really giving yourself something that's going to replenish you so that you don't deplete, whether it's 5 minutes of music research shows that 15 minutes tends to be the best increment. It's not so long that you'll skip it, but it's also long enough that you'll get a little bit of that space and time we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. And
then the third thing is really, I think, becoming more self-aware of our patterns of how we respond to stress and overwhelm. And I have that, it's a totally free quiz on my website that people can figure that out, because my process is so much about self-discovery. But once you know that one pattern, that's your main pattern, you can start to, and in the quiz, I give you tools to start to recognize your needs based on that pattern. So I think that's the third thing, is start to become aware of, how am I responding? How am I seeing the situation? Versus, there's stress and overwhelm lead to comfort eating. And I think an important kind of concrete nugget is that like about 80% of our stress and overwhelm is perceived conflict that we can really resolve if we get out of seeing our patterns as like, once we can resolve our patterns, which is what the comfort eating quiz is about, is to see how do we see conflict and how do we move through that in terms of stress and overwhelm, right? Because when we say we're stressed, there's a conflict between what we feel our capabilities are and what's being asked of us. And so we move into different modes, and the quiz can help people get a lot of enlightenment and insight into that.
And that's
so those would be
easy to find on your website, the quiz.
Yeah, super easy. If you go to alishapiro.com, and then it also / I think it's comfort eating style quiz.
What are the most common triggers that you see?
The most common triggers I see for people are when they feel unimportant, like
Mm-hmm.
in a meeting, like when they suggested something and
Mm-hmm.
people, it's like, that's a big one. When people feel uncertainty, when things come up unexpectedly. And then the other big one is self-doubt of, I should know how to do this. I should, I'm thinking of clients I talked to this week. I should know how to do this computer program. I should know how to set up my computer. All these things, even though it's not their domain knowledge, like I should know this. So that self-doubt is also a really big trigger. And then loneliness, a lot of nighttime eating for people, they're by themselves. So those are some of the, and depletion. So many of my clients are like, I can't believe how so much of this is that I'm just tired and I am using carbs to just give me energy to keep going. Yeah. So is that helpful? Those
yeah,
several.
Definitely. And then just for my curiosity's sake, have you noticed, or what have you noticed using flower essences in your work? And have you seen any specific, like really related things be alleviated by flower essences?
Well, in conjunction with the program that I do with people, they just say like, and I should say too, my clients, we are like skeptical of ease, right? We're like hardworking, like something's easy, I do not believe you, right? Like we pride ourselves on hardworking. So I always preface this with like, ladies, like I do not trust ease except when it comes to these flower essences. I'm like, Katie is magic. And they listen to your podcast episode and they're like, we love her. And I'm like, she's wonderful. I'm like, she's the real deal. Because sometimes, people portray something online and then they're not quite the same. And I'm like, she is like Mother Earth and like so wise. And so what they find is that they are able to like, because part of these patterns, right, they're everywhere, which makes them hard to see. It's like a fish being in water.
Right.
So when they spray the flower essences and also the serums as well, am I using the right term? The serums,
elixirs,
the elixirs, yeah.
Yep.
Is it gives them they say that they can, it's again, I think it's they're getting in their body, but it opens them up from that defensive place to say, oh, that's what I'm doing. Because some of these patterns we don't want to admit we're doing, right? It's like, oh, but they're like, oh, and it helps them move through them calmly and profoundly. That's what they've told me. It's like, I spray that. And it's not that the stress doesn't keep coming.
Right.
It's
There's more space.
There's more space. And they're like, I'm more clear. And it just grounds me and gives me that pause. But again, I think that the essence, it's the ritual of it, but it's the essence is in it. I mean, I use them before I have one right here, right before our, I use them every day. It's just kind of like, and again, this kind of comes back full circle to when we detach, our body's still picking up signals, whether we detach from our body or not. And when you have the flower essences, you're grounding yourself. Your body is relaxing and being connected to nature. I mean, in nature, my God, the studies on nature, and you're bringing this potent piece of nature into our industrial environments, and I think that's one of the biggest things I've learned from you is even, when you go and do these things and you do them so intentionally, and oh my God, I love watching your Instagram feed. Definitely does not lead to compare and despair. It's like, I want to go to Iceland, or I want to go visit Katie in Arizona. But it gets us back into what's present and to what's true. And I'm like, oh my God, this part of nature can be so healing. And we can find it in crazy places, including our office environments. And so kind of gone on, but that's how I see it. Really, the flower essences really work for clients, and they order like tons, and they love trying them. And it just gives a tool that, again, is making things easier for them. It really does. And I think that's part of why I love your work so much, is it's like nature is joyful. It's beautiful. It's like we forget that healing can be really joyous and really fun. It's challenging, but it's also so revitalizing.
Right. Can be fun and beautiful.
Yes, it has to be, right? Otherwise, why would we do it? Like, it would be much easier to keep. I mean, and I love dark chocolate too, right? But like, there has to be something incentivizing to pull us away from the pizza or the chocolate. And again, I'm not talking about 1 or 2 squares. I'm talking about when you feel powerless over it, in the evenings.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention your podcast. What can listeners, if they want to jump in on your podcast, expect to hear about?
Yeah, well, I would start with your episode because people love it. But Insatiable is holistic health. And, my positioning statement is radical truth for every body. And so we look at the cultural body, often referred to as the political body, not partisan, but where are the power structures, right? Like our medical system uses war metaphors, and we talk about how that influences, a war on nature, a war on our bodies. So we look at things very holistically. We had Dr. Kelly Brogan, who's also been on the Flower Lounge podcast. We have really integrative people who are pushing the boundaries and really, I think, reconnecting us with the ancient wisdom that's all that we're ready to really listen to. But I bring my clients on, those who are wanting to share their stories, integrative health, but it's a lot about food freedom from very different viewpoints, not just the food, but also the beliefs and the stories and how we actually heal versus kind of the patriarchal version of healing we've been taught to kind of just move on. And it's non-dogmatic. I joke it's for bad joiners. So if you're looking for like, oh my God, this is like, there's one way, this is not the podcast for you.
Many, many ways, right?
Yes, yes.
So for anyone who's interested in more of Allie's work, you can visit AllieShapiro.com, and her podcast is called Insatiable. And just to wrap it up, Allie, is there anything that you find yourself sharing with people? Like, what's that one message that you find yourself sharing all the time, or any last little nugget that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I want people to know that they are a wonder and not a widget. I know it sounds very, very random to wrap up on, but this process of healing and being present and getting back into our bodies, you start to see how wonderful and amazing our bodies, which are part of nature, are. And we've kind of been put into this widget mold of whether it's calories in, calories out, or just take this medication or just do this formula. And it's like you're missing out on the mystery and the beauty and learning who you can become. And so I just hope everyone realizes that you aren't broken. You don't need to be fixed. All of these things that you think are wrong with you are just patterns that can be unraveled, unlearned, and replaced with something much more magical.
Amen. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you so much for being here, Allie.
Thanks for having me, Katie. You are medicine.
Aww, likewise. Thank you so much for listening to The Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at lotusway.com.